The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the Colorado ranch as Eleanor Whitmore stepped off the stagecoach, her boots sinking into the soft earth. The wind picked up, whispering over the wide, empty plains, carrying the smell of dust and something else, something far more sinister. Her eyes swept over the property, her heart sinking as the reality hit her like a cold slap. This was not what she had imagined. Thomas Brennan's letters had painted a picture of prosperity, of a thriving cattle ranch, a new life, and the promise of a future she could only dream of back in Boston. But the farmhouse before her looked more like a ghost of a place once full of life. The door was askew on its hinges, paint peeled like dead skin from the walls, and there was no sign of livestock. No cattle, no bustling activity, just the silence of a place left to rot. Eleanor clutched her 2 suitcases tightly, her knuckles white against the worn leather. Where's Thomas? She had no answers. No husband to greet her, no warm welcome. The promise of a better life had brought her here, but instead, she felt like an intruder, lost and abandoned in the wilderness. The sound of small feet approaching snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned, and there, standing on the rickety porch, was a small girl. Her dress was torn, dirt smeared across her face, and a purple bruise marred her left cheek. She held a ragged doll in her arms, one arm missing, like a silent reminder of everything broken in this place. "Are you the lady who's going to marry Papa Thomas?" the girl asked, her voice barely louder than the wind. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Papa Thomas? The words were foreign, unfamiliar, and they sent a chill down her spine. These children thought Thomas was their father. But in all his letters, Thomas had never mentioned children. He had only spoken of cattle, land, and dreams of a better future. Had she been deceived? Why hadn't Thomas said anything about a family? Her mind raced as she dropped to her knees to meet the girl's eyes. "Where is Thomas?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. The little girl looked down, stepping aside as an older boy, maybe 14, emerged from behind the house. His shoulders were too broad for his frame, his face gaunt with hunger, but there was a certain strength in his eyes that had seen too much for his age. "He left 3 days ago," the boy said softly, his voice cracking. "Said he'd bring food. Said he'd bring our new mama." Eleanor's stomach churned as she looked around. The barn sagged like a dying animal in the distance. The well pump stood still, broken. These children had been alone for 3 days. Alone without enough food. The ranch was a skeleton of what had been promised. As the boy stepped closer, Eleanor's eyes landed on his wrists, where fresh rope burns circled his skin. "Fresh ones. Someone's been hurting you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The children exchanged glances, silent glances that spoke volumes. The boy's jaw tightened as he met her gaze. "Mister, Crawford says we belong to him now," he said, barely above a whisper. "Says Papa Thomas owed him money. Says when Papa Thomas don't come back, we gotta work his fields." Crawford. Eleanor's mind flashed to the name, but it wasn't in Thomas's letters. Who was this man? Why was Thomas in debt? And what was this about owning children? The wind picked up again, carrying a scent that made Eleanor's stomach turn. Something wasn't right. In the distance, she saw a rider approaching fast, a cloud of dust rising behind him. That must be Crawford. The boy's voice quivered with fear. "That's him. He comes every day now, checking if Papa Thomas came back." But Eleanor wasn't looking at the rider anymore. Her gaze had shifted, her heart skipping a beat as she noticed something buried behind the barn, partially hidden in the tall grass. A mound of earth, too small for a man, too large for an animal. It was fresh, no more than 3 days old. Her blood ran cold. The rider's horse snorted as he pulled up near the porch. Crawford dismounted with practiced ease, his boots clicking against the dry ground. His face was clean-shaven, ordinary-looking at first glance. But Eleanor could see the coldness in his eyes, the malice just beneath the surface. This man was dangerous. Well, Crawford said, eyeing Eleanor like she was livestock at auction. "Thomas Brennan finally sent for reinforcements, though I'm not sure what use a city woman will be." Eleanor swallowed her rising panic, forcing herself to speak with the steadiness she didn't feel. I'm Eleanor Whitmore, Thomas's intended wife. Where is he? Crawford's laughter was dry, like dead leaves in autumn. Intended wife? Ma'am, Thomas Brennan couldn't afford to feed these brats, much less take on another mouth. The words struck her like a slap. Thomas Brennan couldn't afford to take care of his children? And if Thomas had truly promised to bring her here, why hadn't he mentioned them? He left owing me $800 and change. Crawford's voice lowered, and he made a show of placing his hand on his gun belt, the movement too casual. These children are my collateral now, and this property is mine. Eleanor's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the situation. 800, Thomas's letters had painted him as an established rancher. Why would a prosperous cattleman need a mail-order bride? And where were his cattle? Where exactly did Thomas go? She asked carefully, trying to steady her breath. A flicker of unease crossed Crawford's face. Business in Denver, he said quickly. Cattle buyers. The lie was thick, and Eleanor could smell it. She glanced over the property again, searching for something, anything, that would confirm Crawford's story. The corral gates were wide open, the barn empty. If Thomas was a cattleman, she asked softly, where are the herds? Before Crawford could answer, the sound of hooves echoed through the air again. Riders emerged from the trees, more of Crawford's men. They were surrounding the house. Get inside, Crawford barked. All of you. Now. But the oldest boy stepped forward, his body shielding the younger children. You killed him, didn't you? He asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. You killed Papa Thomas. The words froze Eleanor in place. Crawford's expression darkened. Shut up, boy. But the boy didn't back down. You killed him when he wouldn't sign the papers. You put him in the root cellar, didn't you? Eleanor's blood ran cold. Thomas was in the root cellar. And if Crawford had done that to him, what would he do to her or the children now? Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the wind howled around her. The words echoed in her ears. You killed him. Thomas Brennan, the man she had traveled across the country to marry, was dead. He had been murdered by the very man standing before her. The lie had unraveled in an instant. She wasn't here to start a new life with a rancher. She was here because a desperate group of children had written to her, and now they were trapped in a nightmare of betrayal and violence. The youngest girl, Lucy, clung to Eleanor's skirt, her small fingers trembling. Papa Thomas was trying to save us, she whispered, her voice shaking. He was bringing you here to help us. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Thomas had been trying to save them. But how? What had happened to make Crawford treat these children like property, like cattle to be bought and sold? The truth seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting a crimson light over the ranch. The sky was on fire, and the world felt like it was closing in around her. What could she turn? There was no one here to help, just Crawford and his men, and the children who had placed their hope in her, a hope she wasn't sure she could fulfill. Crawford's voice cut through the air, sharp and full of malice. I suggest you stay out of this, Miss Whitmore. You don't know what you're dealing with. His hand rested on the gun at his side, a silent threat. These children belong to me now, and if you want to stay alive, you'll stay out of the way. Eleanor clenched her fists at her sides. Stay out of the way? She had come this far, risking everything for a man who was already dead. And now, standing before her, were 6 children who had been abandoned, abused, and left to fend for themselves. She couldn't back down now. Before she could speak, the oldest boy, Samuel, stepped forward. His young face was set in determination, his eyes fierce with a maturity that only came from surviving unspeakable horrors. You're wrong, he said, his voice steady. We don't belong to you, and we're not afraid of you anymore. Crawford sneered at Samuel, his hand tightening around his gun. You think you're in control here, boy? You think you have any say in what happens to you? But Samuel didn't flinch. I've had enough of men like you, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You've hurt my family for the last time. Eleanor felt a surge of pride for the boy, the fire in his voice giving her strength she didn't know she had. but she also felt a cold knot of fear settle deep in her stomach. What was Crawford capable of? What would he do to silence them? A shadow passed over the group as more riders approached from the hills. More of Crawford's men. Eleanor's eyes darted to the horizon, her heart sinking. How could they fight all of this? Then, as if answering her unspoken question, the sound of hooves echoed from behind the ridge. A cloud of dust billowed up, and through the haze, Eleanor saw the glint of badges. Sheriff Dalton and his deputies. They were coming. Crawford's expression shifted, a flicker of panic crossing his face. He turned his attention back to Eleanor, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You'll tell them what I want them to hear. Nothing more, nothing less. But Eleanor was already thinking ahead. She could see it now. The truth was finally within reach. The sheriff could bring justice to these children, but only if she played her part. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone here? I'll tell them the truth, Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady. I'll tell them exactly what I've seen. Crawford's eyes narrowed. He could see the resolve in her, and for the first time, Eleanor felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. The children weren't alone either. They had been playing their own game all along. The sound of approaching hooves grew louder, and Eleanor knew the moment of truth had arrived. She could hear Sheriff Dalton's voice, commanding and firm, calling out to Crawford. Drop your weapon, Crawford, he shouted, his voice echoing across the canyon. This ends now. But Crawford wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. He grabbed Lucy, holding the barrel of his gun against her head as he glared at the sheriff. Stay back, Sheriff. This is private business, he sneered. Eleanor's heart stopped. No, not Lucy. Not the child who had been through enough already. She took a step forward, her legs trembling. Let her go, Crawford. Your fight is with me. Not her. Crawford's lip curled into a snarl. I'm done with you, woman. You should have stayed in Boston. Before Eleanor could respond, Samuel's voice rang out across the yard, clear and strong. It's over, Crawford. You're done. Eleanor turned, her breath catching as she saw the rifle in Samuel's hands, trained on Crawford. The boy was ready to fight, ready to finish this. The sheriff's men were moving, rifles aimed at Crawford's men. The time for talking was over. The air was thick with tension, but it was also thick with something else, something that Eleanor hadn't expected. Hope. Just when it seemed like Crawford might strike, the sound of gunfire erupted from the trees. Samuel's plan was in motion. The children had set the trap. The gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, sharp and violent, cutting through the air like thunder. Eleanor instinctively dropped to the ground, her heart pounding as the sound of bullets ripped through the air. The children scattered, finding cover behind rocks. Their earlier fears transformed into a fierce determination. Samuel's plan had worked, but the battle was only just beginning. Eleanor could hear the frantic shouts of Crawford's men as they tried to regroup. Their confusion was palpable, and for the first time, they were the ones on the defensive. The once merciless men were now scrambling for cover, trying to make sense of the chaos. They hadn't expected this. Crawford, still holding Lucy hostage, snarled in anger, his eyes wild. You think this is a game, don't you? He yelled, his voice breaking with frustration. You've made a mistake. A big one. Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. How could this be happening? These children had been forced to grow up too fast. They had learned to survive by being smarter than their enemies, and now they were facing the most dangerous moment of their lives. The crack of a rifle echoed across the canyon, and a man screamed out in pain, his body collapsing to the ground. One down. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Samuel. He was moving with the precision of a soldier, his rifle never wavering. He had already taken out one of Crawford's men. The boy was no longer just a child. He was a warrior, just like the rest of his siblings. They had been prepared for this. Through the smoke and dust, Eleanor caught sight of Sheriff Dalton, his deputies spread out along the canyon rim, firing from higher ground. They were in this together now. The children had drawn the lawmen into their web, and now, as the battle raged on, they were all fighting for something greater than just survival. They were fighting for justice. Crawford's grip on Lucy tightened, his face twisted in desperation. "You think I'm afraid of you?" he spat, his eyes darting between the sheriff's men and Samuel's rifle. "You're all going to die here. All of you." Eleanor's mind raced. He couldn't win. Not this time. She had seen the desperation in Crawford's eyes, the fear that had replaced his earlier arrogance. He knew the game was up. Samuel, still crouched behind a large boulder, signaled to the other children, directing them with the kind of leadership that spoke of untold strength. They were a unit now. Each of them had a role to play, and no one was faltering. Even Lucy, despite the fear in her eyes, seemed to understand that this was their moment. This was their chance to end the nightmare Crawford had created. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon, carrying the scent of dust and smoke with it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the battlefield. The world felt smaller now, as if the canyon walls were closing in, tightening around them. The end was near. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she saw Crawford draw his knife, his eyes burning with rage. He was done playing with the gun. He was ready for blood. He lunged at Samuel, but before the knife could reach its target, Eleanor was there. She wouldn't let him hurt the children. With a desperate scream, she threw herself between them, crashing into Crawford with all the force her body could muster. Her shoulder collided with his chest, knocking the knife from his hand and sending them both sprawling to the ground. The world seemed to slow. Eleanor's breath was ragged, and her heart thundered in her chest. She could feel the weight of Crawford's body on top of her, his cold, hateful breath on her face. She couldn't stop now. She had to keep fighting. For the children. For Thomas. Crawford's hands closed around her throat, squeezing with all the fury he had left. "You should have stayed out of it, woman," he hissed, his voice thick with rage. Eleanor clawed at his hands, her fingers digging into his skin. She couldn't breathe. Her vision began to blur, but in the distance, she heard a gunshot, sharp and clear. Samuel's voice cut through the haze. "Let her go." The sound of hooves echoed through the canyon again, but this time it was different. It was the cavalry. Crawford's eyes widened in realization, but it was too late. Sheriff Dalton had made his move. The sheriff's rifle shot rang out once more, and Crawford's body went limp, collapsing on top of Eleanor. She gasped for air. The world came back into focus as the weight was lifted from her chest. Eleanor could see Samuel, standing tall, the rifle still in his hands, the fire of determination never wavering in his eyes. It was over. The remaining men had either fled or been gunned down. The battle was won. But what cost? Eleanor turned to the children, her eyes searching their faces for any sign of relief, of safety. They had done it. They had fought back, and they had won. The sheriff approached, his face a mixture of relief and weariness. "You all right, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, his voice softer now. Eleanor nodded, though her heart felt like it was still racing. "I'm fine," she whispered, her eyes still on the children. They were bruised, battered, but they were alive, and they had made it through together. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat, but underneath it all, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace. The children were free, and she had become part of their story, a story of survival, of redemption. And as the sun finally dipped below the canyon walls, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. They had all been saved. As the dust began to settle and the echoes of gunfire faded into the evening, the landscape felt oddly still. The canyon, once alive with the violence of a battle, was now eerily quiet, save for the distant call of a hawk and the occasional rustle of the wind across the barren earth. The dead lay scattered on the ground, their faces twisted in final expressions of greed and rage, while Sheriff Dalton and his deputies secured the area, ensuring there were no survivors to rise up and make a final stand. Eleanor stood, her legs shaky, her breath ragged, as the weight of the situation finally began to settle in. The children were safe now, but the horror of the past few hours still gripped her heart. She glanced over at Samuel, who was silently watching the aftermath of the battle. He had grown so much in such a short time. The boy was no longer the frightened child who had sent her those desperate letters. He had become a leader, a protector of his siblings, and a force to be reckoned with. Samuel looked at Eleanor, his face drawn with exhaustion, but also something else, gratitude. It was in the way he stood, the way he held himself with quiet pride despite the grim circumstances. He had done it. They had all done it. Against impossible odds, they had defeated Crawford and his men, stopped a network of human traffickers, and brought justice to a place that had long been forgotten by the rest of the world. "Are they going to be all right?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft as she approached Samuel. The boy nodded, but his eyes were haunted, as though the ghosts of the past were still lurking in the shadows of his mind. He had lost so much, his father, his childhood, his innocence. But he hadn't lost his will to fight. "They'll be fine," Samuel said, his voice steady but heavy. "We'll take care of them. We always do." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. The weight of leadership was already heavy on his young shoulders. But in his eyes, she saw something that gave her hope, not just for him, but for all of them. They would make it. The sheriff approached, his face grim. "Crawford's dead. The rest of his men are either gone or taken care of." He glanced at the children, who were still hiding behind the rocks, their faces peering out like wary animals. "We'll get them back to town, Miss Whitmore. Let them rest for a while. They deserve that much." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the sheriff's help, but something else lingered in her heart. What now? The children had been freed, but what would they do with their newfound freedom? What would they do now that they had nothing left but each other? "I'm not leaving," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "I'm staying with them." Sheriff Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Miss Whitmore, I've never seen a woman so determined in my life. But it's no life for you. You've got a future waiting for you, a family. You don't belong here in these hills." Eleanor shook her head. "I don't have a family anymore. I came west to marry a man I thought I knew. But I found something else, something I didn't expect. Something more important than anything I thought I wanted." Dalton sighed, but said nothing. He knew better than to argue with someone who had already made up their mind. Eleanor turned her attention back to the children. "These children have no one, no family, no future." Her voice broke slightly, but she steadied herself. "I'm going to help them. I'm going to give them what I can. A life worth living." Samuel approached, his hand still trembling slightly, but his voice was stronger now. "You really mean that, Miss Eleanor?" She looked down at him, her heart swelling with something close to maternal pride. "Edo." The boy nodded and then, without warning, hugged her. Eleanor stood there, stunned for a moment before she wrapped her arms around him. She was their protector now, just as much as they were hers. The rest of the children slowly made their way over, hesitant at first, but soon they were all gathered around her. The girl, Lucy, who had been so brave earlier, reached up to tug on her sleeve. "Miss Eleanor," she said softly, "do you think we'll ever be normal again?" Eleanor's heart ached for the child. How could she answer that? Could they ever be normal again? What did normal even mean? But then she remembered the look in Samuel's eyes, the look of someone who had found something worth fighting for. "I don't know if we'll ever be normal," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "But we can be something better. We can be a family. We'll create our own kind of normal. And we'll make sure that no one ever takes you from us again." The children gathered closer, the youngest ones clutching her skirts. For the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt since her mother had died, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. The sun was setting over the canyon, casting the sky in hues of orange and red. The day had been long and brutal, but it was ending on a note of hope. The children were safe. Crawford's network had been destroyed, and although the scars of the past would never fade, Eleanor knew that they were no longer just survivors. They were warriors, and they were free. As the sheriff's men began to round up the remaining bodies, and the sound of hooves receded into the distance, Eleanor looked at the children one last time. They were hers now, and she would fight for them, for their future, for as long as she lived. In the end, Eleanor had found what she was searching for, though it wasn't in the form she had expected. She had come west to marry a man, but instead, she had found a family born of struggle, but built on love. And that, she thought, was all she ever needed. Several months had passed since that fateful day in Devil's Canyon. The dust had settled, but the land still carried the weight of all that had transpired. Eleanor stood on the porch of the house she had built from nothing, a house that was now a sanctuary for the children. They had come together to form a family, bound not by blood, but by the struggles they had endured and the trust they had earned in one another. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light over the Colorado landscape. The sky above was painted in shades of pink and orange, a reflection of a new life they had all fought for. Eleanor looked out across the land, her heart full. The ranch was slowly coming to life. The children had started working the fields again, this time with a sense of purpose and hope, under the guidance of Sheriff Dalton's deputies who had taught them the basics of ranching. Samuel, now 15, had become a leader, helping to organize the work and looking after the younger ones. He had grown into his role with a quiet strength that made Eleanor's heart swell with pride. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Samuel was coming, just as he always did at this hour. "Morning, Miss Eleanor," he said softly, standing beside her. "Morning, Samuel. How's the herd?" she asked, her voice full of warmth. "Healthy," he replied, looking out over the grazing land. "Better than I thought they'd be. We'll have a good season." Eleanor smiled, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. The land was starting to yield, but it wasn't enough yet. They still didn't have enough cattle to make the ranch fully self-sustaining. She knew it was only a matter of time before they'd need to make a decision, whether to stay and fight for what they had, or to leave and find something else. "I'm proud of you, Samuel," she said quietly. "You've done more than any of us could have imagined." He shrugged, his usual humility shining through. "I just did what had to be done." Eleanor studied him for a moment, noting the depth in his eyes. He was still a child, but he had become so much more. The boy who had once written desperate letters to a stranger, looking for help, had now become the backbone of their family. "You've earned more than this land, Samuel," she said, her voice catching. "You've earned a future." Samuel's gaze softened. "Maybe I have," he said, "but I wouldn't want it any other way." The air grew still for a moment, the only sound the gentle rustle of the wind in the trees. Eleanor felt the weight of everything they had gone through settled deep in her chest. They had been through so much, and yet they had made it. Behind them, the faint sound of hooves interrupted the silence. Eleanor turned to see Sheriff Dalton approaching on horseback, his usual calm expression replaced with something more solemn. "Sheriff," Eleanor said, crossing the porch to meet him. "What's wrong?" Dalton dismounted, his face hard. "There's word coming out of Denver," he said quietly. "Crawford's partners. They're not finished. The network's bigger than we thought." Eleanor's stomach churned. "But we stopped them. We stopped Crawford." Dalton nodded. "You did. And that's why they're coming for you. They've been looking for you ever since Crawford disappeared. They know you're the one who helped take down his operation." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. "What do we do now?" Dalton paused. "We keep moving forward," he said firmly. "But it's not going to be easy. They'll come after you, after all of us. You've stirred something in them, something they don't like. And when a snake gets cornered, it strikes back with all its venom." Eleanor swallowed hard. She had known this day would come. She had known that Crawford's network wouldn't just vanish, that the people behind it would keep coming, looking for retribution. "We'll need to be ready," she said, the steel in her voice returning. "I won't run. Not again. Not while these children need me." Dalton looked at her with a mix of admiration and caution. "You're a brave woman, Eleanor Whitmore. But bravery won't stop bullets. And it won't stop a network this vast." "Then we do whatever it takes to stop it," she said, her voice unwavering. "We didn't come this far to turn back." Samuel stepped forward, his expression serious. "We're ready to fight. We'll protect the ranch, the kids, all of it." Eleanor glanced at him and saw the same determination in his eyes that had been there when they'd fought for their lives in the canyon. He was no longer a boy. He was a man. Dalton nodded. "All right then. We'll make sure we're prepared. But we'll need help. Word's getting around. The lawmen in these parts are with us." but we may need reinforcements from the other territories. I'll go to Denver, Eleanor said suddenly, surprising even herself. I'll go straight to the heart of it. Dalton frowned. Eleanor, you can't, I have to, she said. I've spent too much of my life as a pawn in someone else's game. This time I make the rules. I'll go to Denver, to their headquarters, and I'll make sure they know who they're dealing with. Dalton studied her for a long moment. And if they won't listen, then I'll make them, Eleanor replied, one way or another. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, the family stood together, unbroken, strong, and ready for whatever lay ahead. The world had changed, and Eleanor knew they could change with it. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor, Samuel, and Sheriff Dalton worked tirelessly to reinforce the ranch, gathering supplies, securing the perimeters, and ensuring that the children would be safe in the event of an attack. It was clear that their fight wasn't over. Eleanor knew the stakes were high. The network that Crawford had been a part of was vast, stretching far beyond anything she could have anticipated. But the determination in the eyes of the children, especially Samuel, gave her the strength to press on. Her decision to travel to Denver was risky. There were no guarantees that the lawmen in the city would be willing to help. But Eleanor couldn't afford to sit idly by, waiting for the storm to hit. The time had come to take the battle to the very heart of the monster that had nearly destroyed them all. As the day of her departure drew closer, she felt a strange calm settling over her. This wasn't the life she had imagined when she had come to the West, but it was the life she had chosen. A life with a bond of family, forged through hardship and sacrifice, meant more than anything else. That morning, as she stood on the porch of the ranch, looking out over the land that had become her home, she felt a quiet peace wash over her. This was her fight now, and no matter what happened, she would face it head-on. The children, her family, depended on her. They had all fought too hard to let it go now. Samuel came to stand beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. He had grown into a man, just as she had grown into the role of protector. In a way, they had both found what they had been searching for, though it had come at a cost. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low but full of concern. Eleanor met his gaze. "I don't have a choice. We don't have a choice." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then I'm coming with you." Eleanor shook her head. "No, Samuel. You've got your family to protect here. Your place is with them." Samuel didn't argue, though the stubbornness in his eyes was clear. Instead, he said, "Just make sure you come back. We still need you here, Miss Eleanor." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "I'll be back. We're going to finish this. For you, for the children, for all of us." With that, she turned and mounted the horse waiting for her, feeling the weight of her decision settle firmly into place. The sun was setting behind her, casting long shadows across the land she had fought to protect. As the horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm beneath her, Eleanor felt the vastness of the land around her. The West was wild, untamed, and unforgiving, but it had shaped her into something stronger. She wasn't just a woman from Boston anymore. She was a survivor, a fighter, and for the first time in her life, she was in control of her destiny. Her journey to Denver was long, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But Eleanor Whitmore had already stared down the darkest parts of the West, and she knew she was capable of facing whatever lay ahead. When she reached Denver, she would walk straight into the lion's den. She would find out who was behind the trafficking network and expose them for all to see. No longer would women like her be taken advantage of. No longer would children be sold like cattle. She would fight for them all, no matter the cost. As Eleanor rode through the night, heading toward Denver, the wind howled around her, but inside, there was a fire that would never die out. She had come to the West looking for a new life, but what she had found was something even more precious, the chance to change the world. And that was a fight worth having. In the desert, mercy rides slower than the wind. But Eleanor Whitmore was done waiting.